The shriek of the train's whistle was a blade cutting the thick, simmering air, and then it was gone, leaving only the grinding complaint of iron and a slow chuffing that faded into the vast, indifferent silence of the prairie. Dust, fine as ground bone, settled on the platform, on the row of hard-faced men chewing tobacco, on the wilted flowers of the women's hats, and it settled on her, a fine gray powder that clung to the silk of her gray cheongsam, a dress made for a different world, a different life. Sue Lin stood perfectly still, her hands clasped before her, the knuckles white inside her sleeves. Her small wooden trunk sat at her feet, a useless anchor in a sea of dust and hostile stares. The man who was supposed to be there, the merchant, Mr. Davies, was indeed there. He looked her up and down, his gaze a violation, an appraisal of livestock. He saw the weariness of her long journey, the fear she tried to conceal behind a mask of placid obedience. He saw a woman, smaller, thinner than the photograph promised. He curled his lip. "This is not what I paid for," he declared, his voice loud enough for the whole platform to hear. A ripple of snickering went through the onlookers. He gestured dismissively. "She's not worth the trouble. Send her back." But there was no back to send her to. The train was a dwindling speck on the horizon. Mr. Davies turned his back on her and walked away, a man washing his hands of a bad bargain, leaving her branded by public humiliation. The crowd, its moment of cruel theater concluded, began to drift away, leaving her utterly alone. She did not cry. The tears were a frozen stone in her throat. She simply stood, a statue of gray silk and shattered hope, as the sun beat down without mercy. From the shade of the land office porch, a man had watched the entire cruel transaction. He was lean and still, a man who seemed to take up less space than he was entitled to. His name was Weston, and his reputation, like his shadow in the late afternoon, was long and dark. He saw the merchant's petty pride, the crowd's casual cruelty, and the woman's unbending spine. She did not sag, did not plead, did not look for pity. She simply endured, her stillness a form of defiance. He had a son to feed. He had a house that was just a building, not a home. He had a deep and abiding weariness that came from doing everything himself. He waited until the last of the gawkers had moved on, until the station master had ducked back into his office, until she was a solitary figure in the immense, empty landscape. He pushed himself off the porch post, the leather of his gun belt creaking softly, the only sound in the dusty quiet. He crossed the street, his boots making no sound. His shadow fell over her before she saw him. She flinched, her composure finally cracking, a tiny tremor running through her. She looked up, her dark eyes wide with a new kind of fear. He was not like the other men. His face was carved by sun and hardship, not by greed. His eyes were clear and direct. He looked at her, at the small, sturdy trunk, at her immaculate, useless dress. He considered the facts of the situation, stripped of all emotion. Then he spoke, his voice a low rasp. "Can you cook?" The question hung in the blistering heat between them, so absurd, so brutally practical, it almost made her want to laugh. Or weep. She did not know which. After the grand humiliation, the pronouncements of her worthlessness, the sheer terror of abandonment in a land where the very language was a barrier of thorns, this was the question that mattered. Not, "Are you all right?" Not, "Can I help you?" But a question of utility, of function. It was an insult and a lifeline braided into one. Her mind, a whirlwind of panicked Cantonese, struggled to find the English words she had so painstakingly learned on the long voyage, but they deserted her. All she could think of was the steam of the kitchens at home, the sharp scent of ginger, the rhythmic chop of a cleaver, the precise science of folding a dumpling. Cooking was not a chore. It was an art, a language, a form of creation. It was order and substance wrested from chaos. It was the one part of her old life that was not a memory of shame, but a bastion of competence. She could not explain this. She could not tell him that she could coax flavor from little more than flour and water, that she understood the secret alchemy of heat and time. So she did the only thing she could. She met his gaze, holding it for a long, silent moment, letting him see past the fear to the resilient core of her. Then she gave a single, deliberate nod. It was not a gesture of submission, but of agreement, a contract. He stared at her for another second, as if weighing the truth of that silent promise. Then he nodded once in return, a mirror of her own gesture. He bent down, his movements economical and sure, and lifted her small trunk as if it weighed nothing. "Come on," he said, and turned, not waiting to see if she would follow. She hesitated for only a heartbeat, then gathered her dignity like a cloak, and followed the tall, silent man into the unknown. The wagon ride was silent and jarring. The landscape that unspooled around them was a study in beige and brown, a harsh, unforgiving expanse of rock and scrub baked under a relentless sun. It was the opposite of the lush, green world she had left behind, and a fresh wave of desolation washed over her. Weston did not speak. He handled the horses with a quiet, competent hand, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Sue Lin watched him from the corner of her eye. He was a man made of the same materials as the land around him, weathered, tough, and self-contained. The homestead, when they finally reached it, was no more welcoming than the journey. It was a small, unpainted board house, a listing barn, and a well, all huddled together as if for protection against the vast emptiness. As the wagon creaked to a halt, a small boy appeared in the doorway of the house. He was perhaps 7 or 8, with the same serious eyes as Weston, and a thatch of unruly brown hair. He watched her with a child's unfiltered, wary curiosity, another silent judge in this land of silence. "This is Finn," Weston said, the words falling into the quiet like stones. He gestured from the boy to her. "Sue Lin?" The boy, Finn, just stared. Weston led her inside. The house was clean, but stark. A main room with a table, 2 chairs, a cold hearth, a small kitchen alcove, 2 small bedrooms. He pointed to one. "This is yours." The room contained a narrow cot and a small crate for a table. Nothing else. "Kitchen is there. Water is from the well." He set her trunk down inside the door and then left, the unspoken expectation hanging in the air. She was alone. For a long moment she stood in the center of the small, bare room, the silence pressing in. Then she moved. She opened her trunk, the scent of camphor and home rising to meet her. She took out her few belongings, a second set of clothes, a packet of needles and thread, a folded piece of paper with her mother's calligraphy. She made her bed. She swept the already clean floor. She created a small, neat island of order in the vast, intimidating strangeness of her new life. She found the kitchen a disaster of masculine neglect. A greasy skillet sat on the cold stove. A sack of flour was open to weevils, and the available provisions were grim. Half a bag of dried beans, a lump of salt pork, some cornmeal, and the compromised flour. There were no spices, no vegetables, no life. For another woman, it might have been a reason for despair. For Sue Lin, it was a challenge. She tied her sleeves back and began. First, water. She made 3 trips to the well, her unfamiliarity with the bucket and rope making the work clumsy and hard. But she did not stop. She scrubbed the skillet until it shone. She sifted the flour, picking out the tiny black specks with painstaking patience. She put the beans on to soak, then turned her attention to the world outside the door. Near the well, she found a patch of wild onions and something that looked like thyme, its leaves small and tough but intensely fragrant. She gathered them carefully. As the sun began to dip, she went to work. Weston and Finn returned from the barn, drawn by a scent that was entirely foreign to the small house. Not the usual smell of frying meat, but something more complex, warm, and savory. They stopped in the doorway and watched. Sue Lynn moved with a fluid, focused grace, her hands sure as she shaped the dough, her face serene in the firelight. She was not just cooking, she was performing a ritual as old as civilization. When she finally served the meal, it was a miracle on 3 plates. A stew of beans and salt pork, yes, but transformed by the wild onions into something rich and deep. And bread. Not the hard, crumbly biscuits they were used to, but soft, warm, fragrant loaves that tore apart with a whisper of steam. They ate in their customary silence, but the silence was different. It was not the empty silence of loneliness, but the full, appreciative silence of men who had just been fed, body and soul. Weston looked at his clean plate, then at her. He said nothing, but he didn't have to. The days settled into a rhythm, dictated not by a clock, but by the sun and the needs of the day. Weston rose before dawn, his work a constant battle against the unyielding land. Sue Lynn rose with him, the house her domain. The work was endless, but it was work with purpose. A fragile truce of coexistence began to harden into something more like trust, built not on words, but on a scaffold of small, deliberate actions. She noticed a tear in the cuff of his work shirt near the wrist. The next morning, he found it on his chair, the fabric joined by a seam of tiny, perfect stitches that were nearly invisible, stronger than the original cloth. He noticed her stumble on a loose board on the porch. The next day, before she was awake, she heard the quiet hammer blows as he secured it, driving the nails home with clean, efficient strokes. The porch was solid now. He was a man who fixed what was broken. She was a woman who mended what was torn. Finn became the bridge between their 2 silent worlds. He watched her, fascinated. One afternoon, he shyly presented her with a fistful of drooping wildflowers. She accepted them with a gravity that honored the gift, placing them in a cup of water on the table, a small, vibrant splash of color in the stark room. The next day, she took a piece of scrap paper from her trunk and with a few deft folds transformed it into a bird that could balance on her fingertip. She gave it to him. His eyes widened with wonder. No words were exchanged, but a bond was forged. The true test came a week later. Finn woke with a fever, his skin hot and dry, his breathing shallow. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Weston. His only thought was the doctor, a full day's ride away. As he moved to grab his saddlebags, a small, firm hand on his arm stopped him. It was Sue Lynn. She shook her head, her expression calm and certain. She pointed to the boy, then to herself. "I," she said, one of the few English words she used. He hesitated, a war raging within him between instinct and a burgeoning, unfamiliar trust. He looked at her steady eyes, her air of quiet competence, and something in him settled. He stayed. She worked through the night, bathing the boy's forehead with cool compresses, brewing a thin, fragrant tea from herbs she had gathered, forcing a few spoonfuls of the liquid between his dry lips. Weston sat in a corner, a helpless giant, watching her. Just before dawn, the fever broke. Finn's breathing eased, and he fell into a deep, healing sleep. Weston looked at Sue Lynn, her face pale with exhaustion in the lamplight, and understood that she had just saved more than one life in this house. A week passed, and their supplies dwindled. Weston knew he had to make the trip into town, but a new reluctance held him. The thought of leaving Sue Lynn and Finn alone, even for a day, felt like a risk. The house had become something more than a shelter. It was a sanctuary he felt compelled to protect. Before he left, he stood awkwardly in the kitchen doorway while she packed a small meal of bread and dried meat for his journey. He cleared his throat. "Do you need anything?" he asked. The question was a landmark, an acknowledgement of her place, her needs. She thought for a moment, the domestic machinery of her mind turning. She needed better thread than the coarse stuff she had unraveled from a sack. And she dreamed of seeds, of putting something green and living into the parched soil. How to explain? She held up her fingers to mime the act of sewing. "Thread," she said, testing the word. Then she led him outside and, with a stick, drew a small square in the dirt, then a few crude shapes of leaves and roots inside it. His brow furrowed in concentration, then cleared. He nodded. In town, the air was thick with heat and gossip. As he loaded his wagon at the general store, he heard Davy's booming voice from the saloon porch. The merchant was holding court, regaling a group of dusty drovers with the story of the Chinese bride. "Sent her packing," he laughed, slapping his thigh. "Skinny thing, wasn't worth the freight. Some women are fine porcelain, and some are just cheap clay. You learn to spot the difference." The men around him chuckled. A muscle tightened in Weston's jaw. He felt a cold, quiet rage build inside him, an anger that surprised him with its intensity. It was an insult, not just to her, but to him, to the quiet, orderly home she was building from the dust. He finished his business, his movements clipped and precise. He bought flour and salt, but also a small, expensive tin of tea. He bought the strongest cotton thread in the store, in black and white, and at the bottom of the sack he placed 2 small, hand-lettered packets of seeds, one for beans, and one for a type of hardy melon he thought she might recognize. He drove home without stopping, the setting sun at his back. He gave her the items without ceremony, placing the sack on the kitchen table. But when she unpacked them, she saw the quality of the thread, the unexpected luxury of the tea, the promise contained in the small seed packets. She looked up at him, and in that look he saw his anger had been understood, and his protection, silently offered, had been accepted. Behind the house, where the sun was gentlest in the morning, was a patch of earth that looked slightly less hopeless than the rest. Sue Lynn saw it not as dirt, but as potential. With the seeds Weston had brought her, a fierce, determined hope took root in her heart. She began the garden with a sharpened stick in her bare hands, trying to break up the concrete hard soil. It was brutal, back-breaking work. The sun beat down on her, the dry earth scraped her fingers raw, and for every clod she broke apart, another seemed to take its place. She worked for 2 days, making frustratingly little progress, her small cleared patch looking like a scar on the land. Weston watched her from a distance, saying nothing, his face impassive. She was not a woman who asked for help, and he was not a man who offered it easily. On the 3rd morning, she woke to a different world. The rhythmic clang of metal on earth had pulled her from sleep just before dawn. When she stepped outside, the air cool and fresh, she stopped, breathless. Where her pitiful patch had been, the ground was now a neat rectangle of dark, turned soil. Weston, his shirt already soaked with sweat, was just finishing, sinking the head of a shovel into a newly dug irrigation ditch that ran from the well to the edge of the plot. He didn't look at her. He simply wiped his brow with the back of his arm, picked up his tools, and walked toward the barn. "It will need water every morning," was all he said. It was the most romantic thing she had ever heard. This was not charity. It was partnership. He had not done the work for her, but had prepared the way with her. She spent the morning planting the seeds with reverent care, her fingers pressing them into the cool, receptive earth. The garden became the center of their shared world. Finn was tasked with watering the tiny sprouts each day, a responsibility he took with grave seriousness. The three of them would often end the day there, standing in the quiet of the evening, watching for the first signs of green, a silent trinity bound by a shared investment in the future they were coaxing from the dust. The garden became a small, defiant miracle. The bean vines climbed the trellises Weston built for them, and the melon plants spread their broad leaves over the soil, protecting it from the sun. The sight of so much green in the brown landscape was a novelty, and when Weston went to town, people asked about it. The story of the gunslinger's strange, quiet housekeeper and her magical garden began to spread, a piece of local folklore. It was a story that eventually reached the ears of Mr. Davies. He had long since put the matter of the Chinese woman out of his mind, a minor business annoyance. But now, hearing her spoken of with a kind of grudging admiration, his pride began to fester. The worthless woman, the cheap clay he had so publicly discarded, was not only surviving, but apparently thriving. In the small, vicious world of his ego, this was an intolerable affront. He felt mocked. His mind, skilled in the art of reframing facts to suit his needs, began to work. He hadn't rejected her. He had merely delayed her placement. She was an asset, and he had been a fool to let her go. He dug out the shipping contract, the paper that detailed his payment for her passage and arrangement. To his mind, it was a bill of sale, a deed of ownership. He would reclaim his property. He saddled his horse and beckoned two of his store clerks, men who depended on his goodwill for their wages, to ride with him. He wasn't looking for a gunfight with a man like Weston. That would be foolish. He was a man of commerce and contracts. He would use the weight of the law, or his version of it, to take back what he now considered his. As the three riders crested the last hill, the small homestead came into view. On the porch, a man, a woman, and a boy sat in the late afternoon sun, a picture of domestic peace. The sight only hardened Davy's resolve. They saw the riders coming, three dark figures moving through the heat haze. Finn, who had been tracing a pattern in the dust with a stick, grew still and moved closer to Sue Lynn's side. Weston didn't move, but his posture changed, a subtle shift from relaxation to a state of absolute readiness. He became what he was, an immovable object, a guardian at the gate. Sue Lynn felt a cold dread, a sickening echo of the train platform. She placed a hand on Finn's shoulder, her touch a silent reassurance, though her own heart hammered against her ribs. Davies and his men reined in their horses a few yards from the porch, kicking up a cloud of dust that drifted over the new garden. Davies dismounted with an air of theatrical importance, leaving his men in their saddles. He smoothed his waistcoat and approached the steps, a ledger book and a folded paper in his hand. He ignored Sue Lynn completely, addressing his words only to Weston. "Weston," he began, his tone attempting a false bonhomie that fell flat in the tense air. "A misunderstanding. I've come to collect my property." He held up the contract as if it were a holy writ. "I have a bill of lading here. Paid for her passage, her contract. She's indentured. The law is quite clear. She belongs with me, in my establishment." Weston remained on his feet, his thumbs hooked in his belt, his gun a heavy, silent presence at his hip. He didn't look at the paper. His gaze was fixed on Davy's face. "She's not property," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "and she belongs nowhere she does not want to be." The two men stared at each other, the space between them crackling. It was not a conflict of pistols, but of principles. Davies, flustered by the simple, unbreakable statement, gestured at Su Lin. "She doesn't have a say in it. She's an acquisition." It was then that Su Lin moved. She took her hand from Finn's shoulder and took a single step forward, placing herself slightly in front of Weston. She looked directly at Davies, her face no longer a mask of fear or submission. It was the face of a woman defending her home. And then she spoke, her voice not loud, but so clear and steady it cut through the tension like a razor. "I am not a thing," she said, the English words slow, deliberate, and perfect. "I am not yours." The words, so simple and so powerful, struck Davies like a physical blow. He had expected tears, submission, or terrified silence. He had expected to deal with Weston. He was utterly unprepared to be confronted by the object of his dispute. Her voice, calm and possessing a strange formal clarity, stripped him of all his bluster. He was no longer a respectable merchant reclaiming his due. He was a bully standing on a woman's porch, revealed as petty and cruel in the light of the setting sun. His two hired men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles, suddenly aware that they were on the wrong side of something fundamental. They looked at the woman, at the unyielding man beside her, and at the small boy who watched them with wide, judging eyes. This was not a business transaction. This felt like a violation. "Now see here," Davies stammered, his face turning a blotchy red. "The contract—" "The paper means nothing," Su Lin continued, her confidence growing with every word she had rehearsed in her mind for weeks, words she had practiced with Finn in the quiet of the evenings. "I am a person. This is my home." She said the word home with a particular emphasis, her gaze sweeping from Weston to Finn, to the sturdy porch beneath her feet, to the green rose of her garden. It was a declaration of fact and a staking of a claim. Davies looked from her to Weston, seeking an ally, and found none. Weston hadn't moved, but his very stillness was a threat. He took a single, deliberate step forward, off the porch, and onto the same ground as Davies. The movement was small, but the meaning was enormous. He was no longer defending his house. He was asserting his territory. The air grew thick and heavy. Davies looked at the hard set of Weston's jaw, at the cold fire in Su Lin's eyes, and he knew he was defeated. There was no contract in the world that could win this argument. With a final, sputtering curse, he snatched his paper, turned on his heel, and mounted his horse. "You'll regret this, Weston," he spat, but the threat was empty, the words of a man who had already lost. He and his men rode away, their retreat hasty and undignified, leaving the three figures standing together in the golden light of the coming dusk.